Welcome back, venturers. It's time for another discussion about VNs. I am Amar, and I'm joined by my glorious co-host Tauros to tackle the topic of self-insert protagonists. So, how would you shape the shapeless self-insert protagonist in your mind, Tauros?
Hello, everyone. Yes, self-inserts are a long-standing aspect of visual novels and other media as well. And trying to define one, though, is surprisingly difficult. So, to describe what does a self-insert look like to me, it would be a main character with an absence of personality. It's a character meant for the reader to live through the story as that person. I don't mean someone as, say, just a main character whose eyes you follow as the story progresses. I mean it's more as I'm this guy in the story. And I feel like there's a few different ways you can interpret that, but as I mentioned before, that absence of personality, that void, you can say, for the reader to insert themselves into the story. That's what makes something a self-insert, in my opinion.
I mean, while it is an absence of personality, you don't think, or at least I presume you don't think in the extreme of having an aloof personality, of being detached.
No. And see, that's the difference, is that you have some characters who have personalities that seem adjacent. Sorry, backing up a little. Typically, when you have these voids of characters meant for the reader to fill, they don't have much of a personality to begin with. It's that typical joke in moeges, how you have a main character who's just generally kind and considerate. And that's their only impact in the story, and yet you've got these romance stories where you have a whole harem of high school chicks who are falling in love with the main character. And it's meant to be for the main character, for the reader to insert themselves in the main character, you know?
Yeah, but do you think that kind of nondescript, good-natured personality goes in tandem with motivation that is very unoffensive, often unambitious style of let's have peaceful high school life last forever. You've seen that trope forever, right?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, you're asking if, like, the motivation? Yeah. What do you mean by motivation playing into it?
Yeah, I'm asking, is that the package of having an ambitious person also be devoid of personality?
An ambitious person?
Unambitious.
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 I mean, yeah, I think that goes hand in hand in the sense that you have a character who isn't exerting themselves into the story. Because the more you give a character goals, dreams, aspirations, personality, the more they become a well-rounded, depthful character. And I think the more that takes away from being someone the reader can identify with. Well, I'm sorry, I take that back. Not just identify, but insert themselves into. One example I thought of while I was mulling this over is Reiki from Little Busters. He's the main character in that story. He is generally kind and reserved and a bit timid, which is the sort of typical behaviors you'd expect out of a self-insert. But he didn't feel like one. He did have his own, thoughts and his own sentences speaking to his group of friends. He had his own sprite, after all, and face. He felt like a character who was simply, a bit shy and withdrawn, instead of a self-insert who is shy and withdrawn because they have nothing else to offer. But, so that's my general outlook on a self-insert and what it means. What about you, MR?
Yeah, I mean, I like your example, because one example of often cited self-insert that I'm reluctant to agree with is the main character, the protagonist of Nekopara. He starts off being the good-natured personality, without any flaws or any real strengths. But I feel like even from day one, just the fact he has ambition of living on his own terms and running a restaurant by his own design, I feel like this is enough to make him stand apart from self-inserts. Although I understand that there's a lot of other factors that lends people to name him self-insert, such as not being voiced, not having the no-face syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
But just the fact that he had that motivation guiding him forward of, yeah, I want to stand on my own 2 feet running the restaurant, I felt from day one that set him apart from the vague, nondescript self-inserts.
Interesting.
Now, funny enough, and then this is something I actually want to ask you, do you feel in episodic VNs you could lose the status of self-insert? And again, to cite Necopara, that critique of him being a self-insert has diminished since the 4th entry. And that 4th volume gave a lot of development for the main character, specifically.
I don't know if it being episodic has to do with anything, but I do agree that over time, developer input can change. If anything, you would see this most often in mobile gacha games. When a game first comes out and it's... You can imagine that the beginning is probably cheap, or that they're still trying to figure out where the story is going or the tone they're trying to set. And throughout the weeks and months as the game goes on and as the story progresses, the writers and the developers can get a feel for more things. And once the story starts building into higher emotional stakes, then they can start making the main character maybe be more proactive, maybe exert himself more, or be in charge of the story at certain points. And so, of course, something like that would naturally also extend to visual novels if they're episodic. If they start building into something greater than anticipated at the beginning. I can see that happening, yes.
Okay. Again, this was a very curious case in that Necopara even gave him face, which is so funny to even say out loud. But before Volume 4, the only face of the protagonist that existed was for the spin-offs, meaning for the anime adaptations and OVAs. Never for in the games themselves.
Interesting. Before we go any too much farther, I do want to say that I don't want to sound like I'm bashing on self-inserts the whole time. There are good parts to being a self-insert as well. I mean, the most obvious is that, like, you get to be the main character of some awesome story. You're like, oh yeah, I'm living my best life in high school with buddies and hot babes, yeah.
I mean, to go back to our episode about healing VNs, right? It is directly, or at least that's what I believe, it is directly correlated how well you can relate, or at least see yourself in that situation, to how that healing genre can affect you and how can serve its role to heal you. And on the other hand, a title that I hold close to my heart, Hate series, I always cite as one of the best immersive title, one of which is the protagonist is self-insert.
Yeah, in the first one, Analog, the main character is a explorer through outer space investigating the ruins of a ship, and you come across some text logs, and the AI just actually speaks to you as you're going through the text logs, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And so it's you quite literally are the part of the story. You're the person interacting with this AI and going through the logs.
Yeah, they go above and beyond on the immersion. You literally are playing a detective using a interface of keyboard to talk with anime rendered characters on the screen, which is, if you from the outside perspective, is exactly what you do as a player reading VNs. So that was just hilarious level of immersion. They went above and beyond, and I really like that title because of what they achieved with that setup.
Yeah, it's a funny premise to make yourself, you as in the reader yourself, very involved in this.
And to be frank, I don't recall many times the title had to break the fourth wall to call you the player. No. Every single time it tries to talk to you as a character, but there were so little barriers between you and the game because you are sitting on the desk and you are using keyboard to talk with anime render AI. There's so little barriers of immersion. Like, yeah, it just works.
Speaking of barriers to immersion, there's another good thing about having a self-insert character. It's that you can also decide how you want to play. This is something that's more common in video games, like for example, Elder Scrolls, where you are your own character. You generally have, some sort of ignorable background details or whatever, but you can just go out in the world and start playing however you want. If you want to, fight for the side of justice and be an upstanding citizen, or if you can go breaking into everyone's houses and stealing everything, or if you could just go nuts acting like a bandit out in the countryside. This is one case in which getting to self-insert yourself and playing however you want to play is practically the whole enjoyment. And unfortunately, it's like I was trying to think of any visual novels that might have that same level of interactivity. I'm not sure if there are any though, because what I'm describing would account for a lot of huge differences, and I don't know if there's anything out there that pulled it off, but I'd be super interested. I do think, getting to insert yourself also gives that opportunity of you playing however you want, leading your character down any desire you want.
I mean, true that the ends don't tend to take into account minute choices or changes, right? Because oftentimes the ends don't have gameplay to reflect that, whereas games can do that. While you may not shape the story with your choice of resolution of problems, but the gameplay can reflect that, or in whatever system you choose. But do you feel that example you gave is that the case why some VNs tend to incorporate more meaningless choices to make people have some even fake way of expression of how to tackle a situation, even if in the grand scheme of things it doesn't change the road or ending, but you have a meaningless choice to roleplay in a way.
Especially if you get two similar questions, like you can ask the girl, "How was your day?" or like, "How'd things go with the archery club?" And it's like, okay, well that just leads to like the same stuff. I don't know how much of that has to do with self-insert characters, because it's totally possible to have meaningless choices littered throughout a VN for a character who is very much supposed to be their own fully developed character. I don't even think that would insert yourself anymore into it. It's not like this would roleplay you into your slot as main character. I feel like it's just more of the sort of fake interactivity. Just it's an easy way to physically keep the reader engaged. I don't. Do you think it has any ties to being self-inserts?
You know what? I feel it may. And especially those meaningless choices that express, like, I don't know, attractors approaches you and you can respond how much you like glasses. That's it. And even though it does not shape neither CGs nor the ending of the story, just the fact you had an opportunity to make that choice made you shape the protagonist in your way. I think this is a step closer to self-insert, although I would say it's not high up on the priority list of what makes a self-insert. But I do acknowledge, I think it may help.
I suppose. Although, like you said, that's really low on the things that can help take a character out of self-insert range. Like Ricky from Little Busters, like I mentioned, he's not his own character because you got a choice to say, do you like glasses or do you not?
Fair enough.
Now, with all that said, there are obviously some bad aspects to having a main character being a self-insert. One of which is that, for whatever reason, like these visual novel devs and artists and people will draw this main character with no face. What gives? Like I know you're trying to make it so that this person is someone you can imagine yourself as in the story, and so you do want it to be as much of a blank slate so you can put yourself on top of it, like an overlay or whatever. But still, not having a face is just way too off-putting. Or like when the hair goes over the eyes from the really long bangs so that you just have this shadow over the top half of their face. It's like, no, this doesn't make me see themselves as this guy. It just makes me think this is so much of a background character that like the artist doesn't even want to include him in the CG. It's like the exact opposite. It's like this guy shouldn't even be here at all. Oh man.
So what you're saying is the moment you see a faceless protagonist, you actually don't imagine your face in that place.
No. Do you?
No. No.
Yeah, I don't. It's like if I feel like anytime you have those CGs where the main character's face is conveniently behind the heroine or something, then it's just like, oh, you're just drawing attention to the wrong part of the CG. I do not like it. I feel like either commit and just give him at least some sort of appearance, even if it's a bland generic appearance. That's better than just not having the face at all. Just having those long bangs or the empty face.
Okay, but to be fair, and I don't want to defend it, okay? But to be fair, there are some titles that go for self-insert protagonists that go above and beyond to never ever have that in any CG ever. Is that better or worse than having a no-face syndrome?
No, yeah, that's better at least. At least you've made the conscious decision where, okay, well, he's not going to have an appearance, so that means we just don't keep him in any shots. We don't create any CGs with him there. Then it's like, okay. But if you can't have it both ways, you can't have it where it's like, okay, we're gonna have a scene with like Mr. Self-Insert hugging the heroine, and then we're just gonna try and blur him out or something. That doesn't work.
Yeah, I tend to agree. At the very least, if you manage to create the entire VN with protagonist, but without showing protagonist, I admire the effort, okay? At least I'll admire the effort.
It's like, okay. If anything, that makes it better, because then that sort of implies that you got to do more point of view shots. Like where you have like the heroine looking at the camera. And then it's like, oh, it's from your perspective. And it's like, okay, well, that funnels, through the whole self-insert aspect. It's like, yeah, at least you're sticking to the style. Yeah, that's good. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and how would you rate on the level of self-insertness nameable protagonists?
Mm-hmm. I mean, those are pretty fun, right?
Is it a big contributing factor?
I'm not
The moment.
exactly an expert on any romance
Uh-huh.
or moege or self-insert stories, so I'm not sure if my opinion holds any real weight. But I do think it's
Okay.
pretty cool that you could type in whatever you want, and it's like, yo, that's me in the script. Although,
It's
there is one
uh-huh.
noticeable bad part in that if the VN has voice acting,
Yeah.
they're probably not going to say your name. And in
Yeah.
any
Yeah.
sentences where your name shows up, it's like there's some sort of workaround that where their voices aren't matching the script anymore, and it's like, okay, well, that's a little jarring.
Exactly. Exactly. I I mean, it creates its own host of problems. Again, maybe this is my resistance to immersion, but whenever I encounter a VN with nameable protagonist, I just go with default. And oftentimes they do provide a default name. They don't force you to come up with anything.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a few titles where they provide a few defaults, and that's what they have the voice acting for. Like, sure,
Oh,
yeah, yeah, like, sure, you
oh,
could name your character anything, but if if you use one of these 5 presets or whatever, they'll use that voice acting name clip for everything,
okay.
which is
That,
interesting.
that is our approach. Okay.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it's nice. Like I'm a sucker for style, and whenever a VN just commits to a style through all its avenues, through like the art, the music, the voice acting, the characters. And so if you have a self-insert and that you at least stick to the dedication throughout the whole thing, then I like that. I appreciate that too. I respect it. Well, how do you feel about it, Amar?
I mean, the consistency of style is always appreciated. I mean, oftentimes because it requires attention to details. The moment you are not attentive to details is the moment the style breaks, right? Or you aren't committed enough. So on that, I agree. How the consistency of style is reflective in whether or not the self-insert is in that title, I don't think this is a big factor to me. I mean, maybe I'm way more tolerant of the no face syndrome. Even that doesn't phase me as much.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Out of those two picks, whether or not to incorporate protagonist in CGs and have his face blank, against protagonist never existed in any shape or form, I think I tend to lean a little bit to the no face syndrome. Because at the very least, I can laugh at that. Okay?
Wow, okay. No, if anything, that's pretty admirable that you can, move past it and not let it bother you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, I can imagine him being put in a position in a CG scene or event that is not always your point of view.
Mm.
And maybe that's a reflective of me who likes to rate sprites of whether or not they have a back sprite. Okay.
Yeah, you and your back sprites.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good attention to have to details. I want my back sprites.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking lately about the appearance, but there is one additional detail that I think is a big negative for self-insert protagonists. I mentioned that another part of it is very much that they have no real personality, and as such, the plot and the writing of a visual novel suffers because they now have to explain how all these chicks are falling head over heels in love with this main character guy.
True,
Sometimes,
they often
that
also don't have any backstory, right?
the main character himself,
Yeah.
probably not. Maybe.
Exactly.
Because I was about to say, this isn't entirely a negative. You can totally have solid writing, comedy, slice of life scenes that just focus on the relationship and building the scenes and all the, gooey, happy, lovey dovey romance stuff. You don't exactly need a fully developed main character perspective for that to happen. Makes it easier, I would think, yeah, but it's possible. You could have good works. And on the flip side, you could also have, some dude who's cardboard and these cute girls who fawn over him, and you're just sitting there thinking, why? What do you see in this guy? And
Yes. A part of the topic of personality, whenever we talk about best girls, right? When we discuss the waifu topics, I tend to approach that discussion on the scale of how well that character bounces off from protagonist. And it's super hard to have any estimation if he barely has any personality whatsoever. That's why, for example, when I brought who's the best girl in Rams, right? I always tend to say Queen Leah, because she works so well with Rams. They create hilarious pair, and it's so much harder to have that sentence whether or not that character works well with the personality of protagonist if he has no personality. So for me, I think it might actually be the most important part of a protagonist. Or if I were to rate what makes it self-insert. That's why I'm going circle back to Nekopara. I was on the fence. On one end, I saw that he had motivation and ambition. But on the other hand, I understand his personality was barely there, other than, yeah, I want to do good things because bad things are bad and I don't want to do them. That was his personality.
Which, I mean, that is something. It's a base, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's the most baseline approach to morality. It's if I'm neutral in all aspects, I tend to lean good, because good tends to be more productive than evil.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. There's one more thing I wanted to mention about the topic of self-inserts, and that's a different angle here in otome visual novels. When you have a female lead and then the romanceable male love interest. I've noticed there are several with how otomes handle their self-inserts are different. Otomes very often will have a sprite of the main heroine, the main character, and in fact, she'll be in many CGs. But then, you have titles like Amnesia, where they are extreme blank slates, and to the point where they're having very little effect on the plot itself, more so things happening to them and getting whisked around by the plot. And it got me thinking that, this is very much a self-insert from the other point of view, but you still have the visual of this character, and you usually have the main heroine be really pretty and have a very detailed sprite. And I guess it's the different approach that you have, in which on the male main character self-insert kind of things, it's always supposed to be as unassuming as possible so you can overlay yourself in. But then it's there's the otome, the main heroine as the main character person, and then she's instead super beautiful and pretty and cute, and you see her very often in the CGs and all of these romantic situations. It's like seeing yourself as that image in particular. It's interesting.
It is interesting, and by no means I'm the otome master. I played very few otome games, but the ones I did, so for example, Fashioning Miss Little Lonesome, I think it was called. Yeah, you are correct. There were a lot of CGs for the main protagonist, and she had her own collection of sprites, and yeah, she was very much present in almost all the shots. Yeah, it is curious.
Yes, but it's still a main insert sort of situation where you still have a character who is mostly defined by a backstory just for the sake of moving the plot forward, and someone who doesn't really exert herself or even speak much at all. And it's always the sort of getting whisked away by the plot as things happen to her. And then you have these other, male love interests who are pursuing her, just like how on the Mareeck side of things, you've got all of these heroines who are falling in love with the main character. It's still the same procedures, it's still the same results, and it's still the same process. But I just think it has some very funny similarities and differences between the whole typical Bishoujo games and the Otome games.
Has a very distinctive style, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
Because now that you mentioned that, for example, Sprite, oftentimes titles that tend to attract self-insert style protagonists tend not to have their sprites whatsoever. So they only exist in CGs, and you pretty much exclusively see the story from their point of view. To such a degree, whenever they appear on screen is a special occasion. Like, oh, you see it for example, you have a brief moment of a different perspective. And in the distance, there's a protagonist, and for example, he attends gym classes, I don't know, or stands on the podium. It's treated as a super special occasion, not a common occurrence. Whereas in Otome, it's the opposite. And the protagonist is often ever present. That is a curious thing that you just brought up.
Very interesting. And so this whole topic of self-inserts has taken us through a few different twists and turns and perspectives on things, huh?
Exactly. Now I don't know what is my number one priority. I think it's still the motivation and personality by which I rate self-inserts. But now that you mentioned such a thing as the presence of sprites, maybe I need to reevaluate.
Maybe. I still think a lot of it is in the personality, how they carry themselves, and what effect they have on the story.
Yeah. And I think on that note, we end this episode. Thanks all our listeners for tuning in, and type in the comments what it takes for the self-inserts to be self-inserts in your book.
I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope you all read plenty of visual novels with all sorts of characters you enjoy, self-insert or not. VNture out!
VNture out!